Welcome to the first in our autumn series of Cambridge University Press ELT webinars. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Herbert Puchter as today's presenter. Cambridge English Empower author Herbert Puchter is a full-time writer of course books and other ELT materials and a professional teacher trainer. He's been a plenary speaker at various international conferences and has given seminars and workshops in over 50 countries. For almost 3 decades, he's researched the practical application of cognitive psychology and brain research in EFL learning. He's co-authored numerous textbooks and resource books, including Super Safari, Super Minds, Empower, Multiple Intelligences in EFL, Teaching Grammar Creatively, Imagine That, More, English in Mind, and if I gave out all the names of these courses, we'd have no time to actually hear Herbert himself. So very pleased to say, welcome Herbert, and over to you. And I'm afraid we don't have any, Herbert, we don't have any sound from you at the moment. Could you just check that the microphone icon is on, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great,
Alistair?
Thanks.
Yes?
Yes.
Oh, relief. Many thanks, Alistair, for the introduction and for chairing this session. It's always great to work with you. And of course with Justina and Charlotte too. I'm currently at home, which is in Austria. So let me wish all those of you who are based in Europe too a good afternoon. A good evening to those in the Far East and a good morning to our colleagues west of here. It's great to meet so many of you here in this webinar space, and I'd like to welcome you all most warmly. We are ready to start now, and I hope you're looking forward to this session as much as I am. I'd like to start with by asking you a question. The question is, what are your main reasons for using stories with preschool children? The answer will probably be just a word or a phrase. Please type your answers in the chat box now. Okay, we have develop language, develop vocabulary, fun, attention, children's imagination, motivation several times. It's entertaining for the children and helps to exemplify language, fun and interesting, makes stories make lessons more exciting, etc., etc. Several of you actually, thanks very much for your answers. Several of you have been referring to the fascination, the motivation that stories hold for children and for the very young ones in particular. In this session, we'll be looking at why this is the case. And I will argue that stories have a very important function that actually goes beyond language. Of course, they help to make language memorable, but at the same time, that very important function that stories have is deeply rooted in our own cultural history, as we will see, and it's extremely important for the development of the whole child. Of course, we are all concerned with teaching language, and stories are an ideal means of conveying language and for making it memorable. But as I've said, their importance can go much further than that. For the child, a good story is more of a journey than an encounter with words. The child participates in that journey by identifying with the protagonists, worrying about them when they are in trouble, for example, laughing in situations that give them relief, celebrating their successes, and thus make meaning of language in a very natural way. We'll be looking at how good stories are an important means of conveying values to children. We will also discuss how we can select and create stories for preschool children, and look at a number of practical tips on how to use stories in the very young learners' classroom. Okay, so here's another question for you. Teaching very young learners is in some ways similar to the teaching of young learners, by which we mean children at primary school level. But it's not exactly the same. So my second question is about the difference between teaching preschool and primary school children. And here's the question. What would you say are the key challenges of teaching very young learners as opposed to young learners? Could you type a few answers into the chat box, please? We have shorter attention span, alphabet, they don't know the alphabet yet, they are not yet reading, concentration span, vocabulary, the language is very basic, behavior, attention span. They're highly kinesthetic. They want to move and run around all the time. That's right, yes. Grabbing their attention might be difficult. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, one obvious answer is, of course, the age difference. And that does have some implications for the teaching and learning process, especially as far as one particular aspect is concerned, and that was mentioned by several of you, and that's the role of reading and writing. This is a rhetorical question, can you imagine what your life would be like without reading and writing? If you can confidently answer this question with yes, then you're probably close to having an innate understanding of what it's like to be a very young learner. But we struggle to imagine life without literacy, don't we? The written word is such an integral part of who we are that without it, life would be almost unthinkable for us. When we're talking very young learners, the key characteristic from a language teaching point of view is therefore maybe not age, but pre-literacy. Very young learners usually represent a primary oral culture, and that's what mainly differentiates them from young learners, that is, children who are actually already able to read and write. So what's it like to be predominantly pre-literate? I'm saying predominantly pre-literate here, as many preschool children know a few letters, often those found in their name, for example. They may also have learned to read a few words in a holistic way, words they frequently see in their surroundings, such as the name of their favorite brand of toys, etc. Only very few children may have reading skills that are more developed, perhaps because their parents have encouraged them to learn to read at home, for example, with the help of storybooks. So we can confidently say that for most preschool children, reading as an independent skill is not part of their learning routines. An interesting theory that, as we will see later, is also in line with findings from the area of cultural science, comes from educational philosopher Kieran Egan. He analyzes the thinking of very young children and, interestingly, notices certain similarities between some forms of thinking which is evident in adult oral cultures and in children's thinking. The claim that there might be similarities between how very young learners develop and the thinking of so-called primitive adults in the pre-literate days of human cultural history may be far-fetched at first thought. But there is an obvious point that comes to mind immediately. For both of them, language is perceived through sound, and usually no written representation of it is accessible to them. Sound is extremely attractive to children, and they love sound effects too. Plus, they are fascinated by all kinds of language in spoken form, such as in stories, in storytelling, songs, rhyme, and in onomatopoeia. According to cultural science, this fascination with sounds dates back to early days of civilization, humankind's pre-literate stages. This is a quotation from a highly interesting book published in 2002 titled Orality and Literacy, the technologizing, sorry, of the word by Ong is the author. And what he says is that all sound is inherently powerful. If a hunter kills a lion, he can see it, touch it, feel it, and smell it. But if he hears a lion, he must act fast, because the sound of the lion signals its presence and its power. Speech is a form of sound that shares this common power. A text can be ignored. It's just writing on paper. But to ignore speech can be unwise. Our basic instincts compel us to pay attention. So we have educational philosophy and cultural science both suggesting that we find stories fascinating because our basic instincts pay attention to the immediacy and the power of speech. When we tell a story to a group of children and it's a good one, then we don't need to tell them to sit still. Many of you have actually mentioned previously that one of the real challenges when teaching very young learners is getting them to pay attention. Well, I think that stories is certainly a very, very powerful and natural means of getting them to do just that. But, and I'd like to stress the but here, it needs to be a good, emotionally engaging story. And this leads us to my third question. And this is not the question yet. This is a group of children mesmerized probably by their teacher telling them a good story. But here's the question. What would you say are the ingredients of a good story for preschool children? Can you please just type your answers in the chat box again? Images. Very important to tell them stories because they make them feel at home. Emotions, humor, elements of excitement. They need to be funny. Characters they can identify with, interesting characters, stories that inspire their imagination, intonation, the teacher's voice, a good narrative style, a sense of adventure, a sense of magic, gestures, the storyteller's gestures, images and sound. They need to be gripping. Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much. These are fantastic answers, actually. And I'm sorry I couldn't read them all out because you were typing so fast, faster than I was able to actually read. Well, a lot of what you're saying is, and have been saying, is very much in line with some key findings from the area of cognitive science. Let me elaborate on that a bit. In her fascinating book, Wired for Story, so she actually, the author, Lisa Cron, actually claims that our brain is wired for story. And she analyzes why stories are so important for humans. She stresses that while we read or listen to a simple sentence, like the question I just asked you a minute ago, our senses are showered with information. Some people actually talk about an incredible number of over 11 million bits of sensory information that we are exposed to in such a short period of time. Well, of course, there is no way we could pay attention or process such an incredible number of sensory bits. Our conscious mind, actually, Lisa Krohn points out, is capable of registering about 40 of those 11 million bits of sensory information. And the conscious mind is able to process between 5 and 7 bits of data at a time on a good day. On a bad day, Lisa Krohn claims it's 5. According to Lisa Krohn, stories focus our attention in a special way because they are conducive to our survival. This, for me, is a very fascinating insight, actually. This is what Lisa Krohn says. The reason our already overloaded brain, overloaded in terms of the sensory input that it is showered with, devotes so much precious time and space to allowing us to get lost in a story, is that without stories, we'd be toast like this. Stories allow us to stimulate intense experiences without actually having to live through them. This was a matter of life and death back in the Stone Age. So again, we're going back in humankind's cultural history. When if you waited for experience to teach you that the rustling in the bushes was actually a lion looking for lunch, you'd end up the main course. And she continues, it's even more crucial now because once we mastered the physical world, our brain evolved to tackle something far trickier, the social realm. Story evolved as a way to explore our own mind and the mind of others, as a sort of dress rehearsal for the future. As a result, story helps to survive not only in the life and death physical sense, but also in a life well-lived social sense. There are a number of important points in what Lisa Krohn is saying here, and I've kind of highlighted them again on this following slide here. Stories teach us, and of course our children, lessons that help us and them to survive. Going back to cultural history, to the early days of cultural history, if one cave person tells another one a story about how a friend got eaten up by a saber-toothed tiger or a lion, then this story is not about entertainment. It's a lifesaver, as it teaches the other person to be cautious. It gives the other person very, very important information that helps them to survive. Consequently, stories help children to make sense of the world, not only about the physical world, but about how to act and how to interact with others, so children can learn very, very important things from stories and not just language, as I said previously. By identifying with the protagonists, children experience things as if they really happened to them, actually. So stories are, as Lisa Krohn put it, I'd just like to reiterate that, they are important dress rehearsals for the future. And this is, of course, the point where values come in. Stories teach us what is right or wrong. And they teach children, and very young children, what is right or wrong. Good stories, that is. As in stories that speak to children because they learn something from them that is relevant to the story they are the protagonists in, their own future. As Kieran Egan, going back to educational philosophy again, stresses the story form is a cultural universal. Everyone, everywhere enjoys stories. The story then is not just some casual entertainment. It reflects a basic and powerful form in which we make sense of the world and experience. So as we've said, story has to offer more than just language. Story is not primarily about featuring as many examples of a certain grammar area as possible, a range of words from a particular lexical set or a list of functional exponents. An impression we might get, unfortunately, when looking at some stories in some language teaching materials, where story is frequently about language only and not at all about meaning and about helping the child to make sense of the world and their experience. With this in mind, let's look one more time at what Lisa Kron says. She says, when a story meets our brain's criteria, we relax and slip into the protagonist's skin. So we in our imagination, we identify with the protagonist, eager to experience what his or her struggle feels like without having to leave the comfort of home. And she further says, and again, this is all from her book, Wired for Story, she says, as counterintuitive as it may sound, the story is not about the plot or even what happens in it. Stories are about how we, rather than the world around us, change. They grab us only when they allow us to experience how it would feel to navigate that plot. Thus, story is an internal journey, not an external one. In other words, we need stories that offer children experiences that help them to navigate in their imagination their real life journeys, experiences that furnish them with important insights that they can draw on when they get into similar situations in the real world, and principles as to what is right or wrong that they can apply as guidelines for their own behavior in their interaction with the real world. I'll come back to these points in a minute. We haven't yet arrived at listing what Lisa Kron calls the brain's criteria for story. Let's for a moment turn to educational theory again. I'm referring to Kieran Egan's work here, and in particular to the work he's done with regard to what Vygotsky says about the development of children. Vygotsky and Egan's work stresses the importance of story and story thinking for the development of what Vygotsky first called cognitive tools. Kieran Egan postulates that a person's intellectual growth happens naturally through the acquisition of certain intellectual qualities. He calls them developments deeply rooted in our cultural history. In order for an individual's intellect to grow appropriately, the development of certain cognitive tools is essential. Very young children go through a stage of development that Egan calls mythic understanding. It's a stage in their lives where there's no difference between reality and imagination. And what's characteristic of this understanding is the child's story thinking, a tendency to mix, actually, reality with imagination. When the teacher uses a puppet, for example, 4 or 5-year-olds know it's a puppet. Yet, when the puppet starts talking, and this is, of course, with the teacher's voice, for the students, the puppet becomes alive. A teacher told me a story not too long ago. She was using this puppet with her students, her preschool students. And one day she came to class And she showed them Max, the puppet, that she was actually using frequently in her interaction with the children. She said something like, "Look at Max, he's keen again. I had him in my washing machine." At that moment, the teacher said, one of the girls in the class started to cry bitterly. Then, when the teacher asked the girl in her own language why she was actually crying, the girl looked at her and said something along the lines of, "You had him in the washing machine. He could have died." So it's the quality of story thinking that is characteristic of the target age group we are talking about. Very young children live in a world, in a story world. In their play, toys are alive, like maybe in the situation that we can see in this picture here. They themselves take up personalities of protagonists they have met in the stories they get told or they see on TV. And they can easily go from story to reality and back again. And sometimes their imagination is so vivid that they don't seem to be able to tell the difference between the real and the story world. I've just seen a comment by Emma Brockhart who says, "My students hug and kiss the puppet that I'm using in my classroom." So this is exactly what I'm talking about here. So what are these story ingredients for very young learners? What are those, as Lisa Krohn called them, those criteria, the brain's criteria for good stories? Well, Kieran Egan stresses that we need a simple structure with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We need, as some of you have actually said, we need a bit of story magic that inspires the children's imagination, such as animals that speak, protagonists that have special powers, and so on. And we need binary opposites, those opposites that create strong emotional contrasts, such as good versus evil, happy versus sad, tiny versus huge, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure that if you think of the stories that you got told as a child, fairy tales from your own cultural context, I'm sure that many of you are now thinking of stories where you actually have those very strong contrasts between those binary opposites, such as good and evil. Good and evil comes to mind when one thinks of the Grimm brothers fairy tales, for example. Those are fairy tales that I grew up on, actually. So we need another element, and that is something unexpected. Something unexpected needs to happen, a problem that needs to get resolved in the end. Anybody who creates stories for very young children, and I'd very much like to encourage and motivate you, if you haven't tried this yet, use these ingredients and try creating your own stories for your children. So anybody who creates stories for very young learners knows how important these criteria are if we want to create good stories, stories that engage students emotionally. Let's talk about these emotional contrasts for a moment. As I said, good versus evil, happy versus sad, etc., etc., etc. They are the basic platform that helps to convey important values. And who wouldn't agree that as teachers, we are educators, as teachers of very young learners, we are educators too, educators that need to be concerned with the kind of values that our students take on board while they're still very young. We often hear people say, these days that young people do not have values, and as teachers we are often requested by the preambles in our state or school curricula to convey important values to our students. But for a number of reasons, this is usually easier said than done. First of all, it's probably a good idea to clarify what values are. We could say that they are the principles that help us form judgments on whether something, a behavior, for example, an action, what a person says or does, is right or wrong. Values are about what we are allowed to do because it's legal and morally acceptable, versus things we shouldn't do because they are either illegal or morally not acceptable. So yes, of course, these are important things to learn for a young child. Let's quickly look at a list of values, but by no means complete, that will probably find agreement with most teachers in democratic countries. Well, moral values. Concrete examples here would be honesty, trust, tolerance of otherness, respect, fairness, etc., etc. Environmental values, and I hope you like my photo here. It's a photo I took in the Kalahari Desert in sub-Saharan Africa. It's swallow-tailed bee-eaters, but that's just an aside. Environmental values, for example, the development of a caring attitude for the well-being of the whole environment, the sense of continuity with past and future, or a commitment to improving environmental quality, to name just a few. Democratic values, as for example the importance of community, the importance of the individual, equality of respect for all individuals, and the importance of personal responsibility, etc., etc. Health values, understanding what is healthy and unhealthy food, anti-smoking, anti-drugs education, and last but not least, art education, as for example, artistic appreciation, learning to understand and respond to life situations through literature, the visual arts, music, etc., etc., etc. For a child, I guess it's very important to learn that life is not just about play, not just about work. Life is also about appreciating art, appreciating good stories. For example, here we are back with literature. Some of you may be wondering why I haven't included spiritual values at all in this list. Well, I wouldn't think they are unimportant, but in a more and more pluralistic society, it would probably be very difficult, if not impossible, to agree on even examples of values in that category. However, I assume that the majority of us would agree on most of the values I have listed above as desirable to be taken on board by our students. However, are these values easy to teach? The answer most certainly is certainly not. And there are a number of reasons for that. One attempt of conveying values that we sometimes see in classrooms that definitely doesn't work and doesn't work well is the use of modals. You must, you should, you shouldn't, you mustn't, you ought to. These don't normally work when it comes to telling children what's right and what's wrong. So we have basically two options, I believe, if we want to convey values to the children we teach. And I totally agree with those of you who have said here that, of course, this is very much something that needs to be done also in families, and parents have a very, very important role here. But we, as teachers, are, of course, significant others, so we have a very important role too. So what are those two options that we have? Well, the first one, I believe, is a very important one, and that is being congruent. In other words, it's not modals, but it's models that work. As teachers, we are, as I've said, relevant others for very young learners, and we can influence children respectfully by showing them through our behavior, through our own behavior, what kind of behavior we want to elicit from them. If I want my class to be friendly with each other, telling them they should or must be friendly will not work, especially if I don't show them what's it like to be a friendly person. The more congruently the teacher can show them what the target behavior is like in action and in interaction in the classroom, the more the children will learn from it and the more they will take on board the behavior we want them to adopt. And the second option we have is the use of good stories. Let me present to you a story that some of you may know, a story I've created with my co-authors Günther Gerngros and Peter Louis Jones. And before we watch the story, here briefly again is Kieran Egan's list of criteria. Oops, sorry, I need to go back. It's Kieran Egan's list of story ingredients, of criteria for story creation for very young learners. And I'd like to invite you to type into the chat box your thoughts while you're actually watching the story that you're going to see right now. Alistair, can I please ask you to start the video here?
Carrot soup.
My favourite. I'm hungry.
Leo.
Oops. Sorry.
Sausages and chips.
My favourite. I'm hungry.
Apples.
My favourite. I'm hungry.
Cakes. And ice cream.
Oh, my favourite.
My favourite too.
Oh no. I'm too full. My favourite.
Okay, I'm really sorry that some of you have had problems with the buffering of this video. First of all, thanks very much for your comments. I saw that several actually seem to like the story, and I'm glad about that. As various colleagues have mentioned, actually, we have a strong emotional contrast here in the story, being greedy versus being generous. And we have these four animals: Leo the lion, Gina the giraffe, Mike the monkey, and Polly the parrot. So what we have is that Leo's friends would like their share of the goodies, their various things they would like to eat too. But Leo sees the world only from a very egotistical point of view, and he doesn't want to share, he doesn't want to give them anything. So what we get from this contrast of greed versus sharing with others is a moral conflict. As a consequence, Leo is happy, at least at first, because he has much more to eat than the others. And his friends are disappointed. This is an emotional conflict that children can easily relate to. They often experience situations where others take away their toys, don't want to share their sweets, etc., etc. They may themselves also have refused to share with others, of course. And in the end, if you haven't seen the ending, the story gets resolved in such a way that children see that it doesn't pay to be greedy. Leo suffers in the end because he is full, so he can't eat any of those sweets that he would like to eat. And sharing would have been a much better option from the start. So a story like this one helps children to make sense of the world and experience, as Kieran Egan puts it. And what's important is that children will understand the message, as it were, without the teacher having to explain it to them. Okay, so we're almost getting to the end of this session. I promised a few tips concerning storytelling. Here they are, 5 of them in total, but this list is by no means complete, of course, and I'm sure you have your own suggestions and tips of what works well in your classrooms. Well, the first one, if possible, use a special space in your classroom for storytelling. For example, get children to sit in a semicircle. Make sure all children can see the input source or sources well, whether this is you as a storyteller, the images you're using. Several of you have mentioned the importance of good images when telling a story, whether it's pictures in a book that you're planning to use, or whether it is actually, like in this case here, a video screen. Suggestion tip number 2, when telling a story, use images, mime, and gesture, eye contact, different qualities of voice, different rhythms and volumes of voice, and pauses to make the storytelling process itself as dramatic and emotionally engaging as possible. Tip number 3, when children enjoy a story, they often want to hear it several times. By listening to a story repeatedly, they will firstly understand more and more about the story, and gradually also remember more and more of the language in it. After some time, you can involve your students in telling the stories. For example, you can start a sentence and then stop, while encouraging your students to say the next word, or the next words, or the next chunk of language. Use mime, use gestures and images to support this process. Number 4, as we know, children are very kinesthetic, as one of you said at the beginning, so they love acting out stories. Many good stories are actually ideally suited to support this. You can start this by telling a story, maybe when you tell it the second or third time, and miming it at the same time. And you will notice that gradually, when you encourage children to do so, your class will join in both with the mime and gradually also with the language or with parts of the language. And last but not least in my list, which, as I've said, is by no means complete, stories are extremely valuable for children because they help to anchor language in the child's long-term memory, but also because they take children on a journey, as we've said. So I think it's worthwhile to revisit stories and the language in them repeatedly over a longer period of time. So that's it, really. Let me quickly wrap up the key points that we have covered before we turn to a few of your questions. We've been looking at the difference between very young and young learners, and we stated that one key difference is the fact that very young learners usually don't read and write yet. They are in a pre-literate stage of their development. We analyzed why spoken language and stories in particular are so important for the development of children's cognitive tools. We took into consideration findings from cultural science, from educational philosophy, and from brain research, and looked at what criteria we need to have in mind when we want to judge the value of stories, for example, if we select teaching materials, or when we want to create stories ourselves. And last but not least, we looked at 5 tips for working with stories in the very young learner's classroom. And before I thank you for listening, I would also like to mention maybe that the story I showed you is taken from, or has been taken from Super Safari, which is my latest course book for very young learners, co-written with Peter Lewis-Jones and Günther Gergos, published by Cambridge University Press, of course. Super Safari is a course that features a lot of, I believe, very, very exciting stories that have been or were written with conveying values in mind, and of course with conveying very, very important language to children. It's got a DVD, and the story I was using is from the Super Safari DVD. Okay, so thanks for listening and for taking part so actively. And now back to Alistair, who I believe has collected a number of questions from you.
I have indeed, Herbert, and thank you very much. It's really interesting. We've got lots of questions coming in already. First of all, from Teresa Vasconcelos, who asks whether that you can suggest any pre-storytelling activities to get students prepared.
Okay, well, it's a very good question, because when it comes to very young learners, we need to keep in mind that very often their language level is of course still very low, and their range of vocabulary is very limited. So first of all, what I do as a teacher when I am about to tell them a story, I look at the story and I check what are the key words that I might need to pre-teach. And then I very often use either a storybook or if you have story cards or the images in the book to pre-teach those words. And then of course children, when they already have a little language, we could get them to look at images and brainstorm language by calling out words that come to mind, words that they can already say in English. So leading into the story, activating the child's prior knowledge, that those seem to be, for me, the two most important aspects here. And of course, we can do that in many different ways.
Okay, thanks. An interesting question from Maria Kutsupaki, who says, what do you think is the appropriate age for using stories to get children thinking about, to introduce themes such as death and loneliness, more problematic, more negative subjects. Should we avoid these during the preschool years?
That's a very good question that I haven't actually thought about. Most of the stories I co-write with my co-authors are actually about emotional contrast. So we always have something negative, which is something like happiness versus sadness. I personally haven't written a story about death, but death is something that very young children, of course, can relate to very, very easily. They see animals that have died, or they know that animals die, and they hear that some people in their families may have died, etc., etc. I don't know of any particular story that might help the teacher to deal with something like that when it comes up. But this is certainly an interesting thought, and I would think that stories would actually be a very good means of helping children handle such difficult situations.
Okay, thanks. I had a question from Agustina Pastrian, who asks how we can engage parents.
Very good question, and very important point. Parents need to be, I think, informed about what we do in our language classes and why we do it. Many parents have this natural, it seems, tendency to, they want to discover as much as possible, or they want to see in their children's lesson as much as possible of the kind of ingredients of lessons they themselves used to have maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. And of course, language teaching methodology has changed. So parents, the expectation that parents bring to or the expectations that parents bring to the classroom might be very, very different from what we actually do. They might expect their child to have to write words from the very beginning, or do dictations, or do grammar drills, or what have you. They might not understand from the onset why games can be important, why storytelling is important, etc., etc., etc. If you can invite parents, if you can show them what you do with your kids, or if you can't do that because it's just not practically possible, if you can maybe invite parents, and when you have an evening with parents, do a simulation of an activity or several activities that you do with their children, so they get insights into the actual process of what learning a language is all about.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Ludmila Snizor, who asks what your favourite story for preschool learners is. I mean, do you have a favourite of
well, currently, it's the one I selected for this webinar here. The Leo the lion and his friends, and this strong emotional contrast between sharing and greediness and greed, because this is something. I have a 5-year-old little grandson. This is something, sharing is something that is so important for young children, and of course they want to have their favorite toy, they want to have the toys, and they don't want to share them necessarily. So I think they need to learn that.
Okay, thanks. Had a couple of questions about meaning as opposed to vocabulary when we're dealing with young learners, about sort of the comparative importance of vocabulary and the meaning of the story. How do you balance those?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question, but maybe, yeah.
Do you focus explicitly on the vocabulary when you're using these stories with young learners?
Okay.
Or
yeah, that's a good question. I think that an approach that has worked very well is to actually focus on topics and have stories that actually somehow dovetail with the overall themes or the overall topics. And of course, if you have a topic like in this case, the case of the story I showed you, the topic would be food. And of course, there is a lexical set that we want to teach. And I think we want children to remember the lexical sets that we teach them. Whether we do this before we tell a story or whether we tell the story first or play the story to the children first and then work on the practicing of those words is something that is up to the teacher in this specific situation in the classrooms. But yes, I think we do want children to practice and remember important words, key vocabulary, and lexical sets, definitely. And I would very much favor a multisensory approach to practicing words. Get children first of all to look at pictures and flashcards, for example, and listen to the teacher saying the words while the children are actually miming the words. Then, for example, get students to point to individual flashcards where the teacher says the word, the children point at the word. The students listen to the words again with their eyes closed, while again they are miming the words. The teacher says the words using auditory submodalities. In other words, whispers some words, shouts others, uses a happy voice with some words, uses a sad voice, etc., etc., etc. These auditory submodalities help children to remember the pronunciation. They are to the ear what color underlining is to the eye. So lip reading would be another example. The teacher mouths the words, moves the lips, saying the words, but not using any voice. The children have to guess the words. The teacher writes numbers next to the words on the board, asks the children to focus on the words for, say, 20 seconds and remember each word with the number that the teacher has written next to it. And then the students close their eyes, the teacher says a number, and the students have to call out the word that the teacher had written, the word that was next to or is next to the number the teacher has just said, etc., etc. There are many, many different ways, and I think that practicing lexis, so students actually remember words in their long-term memory, is something that is very important.
Okay, thanks. So I've got a question that's maybe slightly off topic, but I hope you won't mind me asking it. From Isabel Gonzalez Bueno, who says that although you're obviously talking about very young learners, have you got any thoughts on why it is that storytelling is practically non-existent once you actually move into primary school? Is it that teachers consider stories childish, and is this a bad thing?
Well, I mean, the teachers I have worked with, and that is literally thousands all over the world, know that I would definitely stress many, many times that stories are very important in primary classrooms, and stories should be a staple diet in the primary classroom. I'm not aware that teachers of primary children are not using stories. I'm actually a little bit surprised. But maybe some teachers, maybe some inexperienced teachers think that they are not good storytellers. Maybe you know, they think that in order to tell a story, they have to be actors or actresses. In that case, I would strongly encourage teachers to actually try this, give it a try. They will actually be surprised how good they are at storytelling, and they will also be surprised at how motivated learners are.
Thanks. Just fit in one more question, if we may. So from Amin Gental, who asks, what other tools other than just puppets would be useful for teaching young learners with stories? Sorry.
Well, storybooks, obviously. I mean, using some authentic storybooks if they are accessible to learners of English who are learning English as a second or foreign language. Then, of course, story cards if we have them, or posters if we have them, audio recordings of the stories, video recordings of the stories, and one very, very important means, obviously, is the teacher and the teacher's voice, and the teacher's mime and gestures and the teacher's body language and the rapport that the teacher will manage to create when he or she actually tells their children a story.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Herbert. Sorry that's all we've got time for today. But thanks for a really fascinating session, Herbert. Really enjoyed that. Everyone, don't forget that we'll be back next week when Deirdre Safers will be exploring the 4 principles of engaging online task design. And all in all, we've got 16 webinars scheduled for the rest of 2015. So visit our events page, and I'll just type that into the chat box, and Charles already has, to take a look at what we've got coming up. The recording of today's webinar will be live on our blog and our YouTube channel on Thursday or at the very latest Friday, and certificates will be sent out in the next week or so. So thank you very much everyone for attending, and thank you particularly Herbert for a very interesting session and some great answers to the questions. And if you've won a puppet for asking a very good question, we'll get in touch with you in the next few days to let you know. So if you had a question answered, you've got a chance of possibly winning a Polly the Parrot puppet you'll have seen in that video. So thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Herbert, and see you all next week.